Every street in the world has a story. Some are happy tales of main streets and nights out on the town. Most are average everyday streets, filled with people just living out their lives. But there are some streets with darker tales to tell. Streets with creatures moving through the night. Streets where people disappear without warning. Welcome to Worchester Street, a horror podcast written and narrated by me, James Worchester. I hope you enjoy your stay. Without further ado, let's get into this week's stories with story number 1. If you're on an overnight train to Moscow, don't look out the windows. I'm a businessman that regularly commutes by train between Warsaw and Moscow. I could fly, but I found that taking an overnight train allows me to do far more work while traveling. If you factor in the cost of a night in a hotel, it costs about the same as a flight. I hopped aboard a train departing Warsaw in the early afternoon. I always book my sleeping car to be the last one on the train so that I could watch the country fly by as the train moves. I started working on my laptop, occasionally looking up to stare out the window that spanned the back of the car. The sun began to set as the train wound up into the mountains. Soon, the thick forests on either side of the train were covered in a few feet of snow that reflected the red light of the setting sun. I was starting to get hungry, so I closed my laptop and made my way to the dining car. It was empty, except for a single mother and her 4 or 5-year-old daughter. They were sitting at a table in the middle of the car. I took a seat at a table, and soon, a young Russian waitress came by with a menu. I looked over the selection of drinks and the 3 entrees that they were serving. I ordered a scotch and a steak, then turned to stare out the window at the trees whizzing by outside. The sun had set, so it was easy to see the reflection of the dining car through the window. The young girl was staring at me through the window's reflection. I made a face, raising my eyebrows and sticking out my tongue. She gave me an extremely concerned expression and tugged at her mother. Her mother turned around and shook her head. "Sorry," she said. "Lena is always staring at strangers. I'm Amelia." "No problem," I said. "I'm Jacob. I've got a niece her age back in Warsaw." We continued to chat as the waitress brought back my meal. I just started to eat when the girl began shrieking. Her mom jerked, staring down at her girl. She'd shielded her eyes with her hands and was continuing to scream at the top of her lungs. "Lena?" she said. "Lena, what is it? What happened?" It took her a few minutes to calm down, but she refused to pull her hands from her eyes. Out the window," she said between her sobs. We looked out the window at the trees whizzing by. I almost didn't see it. There was a handprint on the frost that had built up on the window. I stood up and wiped at the glass, expecting it to slide off. That's when I realized that all the frost was on the outside of the car. Amelia stood up, pulling her daughter away. "I think she should get some rest," she said. "Of course, I'm sure she'll be fine," I said, still shaken. I forced down the rest of my meal in silence, ordering another scotch before heading back down towards my room at the back of the train. The train had already entered quiet hours, so most of the lights in the hallway had been dimmed to their lowest setting to help people sleep. I was just a car away from my room when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof of the train right above me. Whoever was on the roof had a noticeably strange gait. The sounds moved back down the train, towards my room. I reached the end of the car and paused with my hand on the door. Something about the sound, something about that child's scream, something about how dark the forest had looked out the windows gave me pause. Then I turned the handle and walked into my room. A humanoid creature with no mouth was hanging outside my window, staring into my room. It was pale white and had long claws coming from each finger. Its eyes were staring directly at me with a hungry expression. I threw my hands over my face and my knees buckled. When I came to myself, I realized that I was on the floor, screaming and still covering my eyes. Several concerned passengers were crowded around me. I couldn't bear to look back out the window to check. I didn't sleep that night. I've been having a hard time sleeping ever since. If you're ever on a midnight train to Moscow, don't look out the windows. I hope you enjoyed the first story. All the stories that I narrate, I personally write. So if you've enjoyed my work, check out The Journal Found at the South Pole, my novella currently available on Kindle and paperback versions on Amazon. I'd also like to shout out my Patreon backers who make all this possible. Private Castle, Melissa Priolu, Lilith Scyther, and my newest backer, Brittany Mencati. Your support makes this possible. If you'd like to support, please check out Patreon. Now, let's get into story number 2. I'm on a caving expedition to reach a record depth underground. We weren't expecting to hear so much screaming. A few weeks ago, my friend Daniel approached me about a new caving project. We'd been on several expeditions together in the past and had been friends for a while. Daniel told me that he'd been doing some research on the abandoned Kidd Mine in Canada. The Kidd Mine descends some 10,000 feet. Due to its already low-lying entrance, that meant that the bottom was the deepest place in the entire world. Daniel brought out a map. He pointed out the bottom of the mine, then brought out a graph that I didn't understand. "This is a seismologic scan of the area that an oil company did recently," he said excitedly, pointing to several peaks and troughs on the graph. "Do you see it?" "Nope," I said. He rapped his knuckle on the paper. Workers reported a cave system underneath the mine. They always assumed it was a small one, but this shows that it could go on for miles and miles. "I've already talked with the owners, and they said they'll let us in. You interested?" I hadn't been on an expedition since a cave diving incident my sister suffered a few months back. I'd canceled on the group at the last minute, but my sister had gone anyway. She didn't make it. I almost shook my head, but paused, staring at the map again. A cave system underneath the deepest mine in the world? We'd make history if we explored it. On top of that, there was no diving. Caving was one of my great loves, so maybe it was time to do something like this again. I told him I was in. We hopped on a flight to Ontario, and soon had driven our rental car to the now abandoned mine's entrance. We double-checked our supplies as the resident caretaker unlocked a few padlocks that closed off the mine from the public. We'd brought enough food and water for a 3-day journey underground. We didn't plan on spending entire days down there, but it never hurt to be careful. We descended down the mine for several long hours, traveling down tracks and going down ladders. Some parts were extremely technical, and we had to tie ourselves up with ropes before risking the rusted-out ladders. As we descended, I started to feel heat coming from lower in the mine. Heat coming from the earth itself, I realized. After a few more hours of stopping and starting, we reached the end of the mine. "Okay," Daniel said. "Let's split up and feel around for any airflows." We did, and after a few minutes, I felt a distinct breeze pulling me to my right. I called Daniel over, and we crept through an extremely small passageway in the rock. It was tight getting through the rock, but we managed. On the other side, we found ourselves in a cave system. We paused there for an hour or so, resting our tired legs before continuing on. To both our surprise, we found the ground smoothed out considerably at the bottom of the cave. It almost felt like we were walking down a tunnel that constantly curved down and to the right. With the smooth floor, we were able to make excellent progress. We must have been walking for 3 hours, always down and to the right, like a corkscrew into the earth. We paused again for a quick bite and a drink of water. "How you been?" Daniel asked from where he sat in the darkness. "Feeling good," I said. "My legs are holding up fine." "Not what I meant. You know you can..." He paused. "Do you hear that?" I listened hard. He was right. There was some noise coming from deeper underground. It was far away, but it sounded to me like another group of cavers. The snap of carabiners was unmistakable. "Is there another group down here?" I asked, shocked. "Another group?" Daniel asked. "What do you mean? Didn't you hear a TV?" "No, I heard carabiners and what sounded like people talking," I said. We got to our feet and continued down, pausing occasionally to listen for more sounds. We pressed on for what must have been another 3,000 feet. The air continued to heat up. I guessed that the cave was at a temperature of around 100 degrees. Then, from up ahead in the darkness, I heard my sister's laughter. She had a distinct laugh that I'd always made fun of. It was unmistakable. From my side, Daniel stepped forward. "Mom?" he asked. I grabbed his arm. "I heard my sister." He rubbed his eyes. "What is with this cave, man? Should we turn around?" I looked further down the still twisting tunnel. "I don't know." We took a few more steps forward. My light flashed across an object in the darkness. It was a backpack. My sister's backpack. I stumbled forward, opening it. Her name was written inside. How did this get... I trailed off, looking over at Daniel. He was staring at his hand, as if looking at something. "Daniel?" I asked. He didn't look at me, instead staring down at his still empty hand. "This is the kind of bottle my dad used to drink." He looked further down the tunnel. Then, more sounds from below. Sounds of thrashing in water. Sounds of someone drowning. I knew, without knowing, that it was the sounds my sister had made. Daniel recoiled, falling to the ground. "Mom?" he shouted. "Mom, are you down there?" We both shot to our feet and began running down the slope towards the sounds. We ran and ran and ran and ran, but the sounds never got closer. We finally collapsed with exhaustion, leaning against the side of the cave. I paused, looking up at the roof, feeling all the pressure of the earth above me, all the heat and weight of the thousands of pounds of rock. Then I looked down, wondering at what things still lay below. That's when the sound of heavy footsteps from below started, slowly getting closer. "Please, tell me you hear those at least," Daniel asked. Yeah. Something told me that I didn't want to see whatever it was that was making those footsteps, that we shouldn't be here when they got to our level. We turned around to head back up, and I flashed my light across my sister, standing just above me in the tunnel. She'd been following us this whole time. She was still wearing her wetsuit, but her face was blue and swollen from the water. It dribbled from her mouth onto the floor when she opened it to scream. I didn't think about the footsteps, or Daniel, or how far underground I was. All I knew was that I had to get away from this screaming, bloated creature standing over me. I turned around and ran down the tunnel, only vaguely aware that Daniel was running beside me. We ran for what must have been a half hour before slowing down, both hyperventilating. We were alone. Alone with nothing but each other, our lights, the silence, and the now stiflingly hot air surrounding us. We didn't know what to do, but heading back up was our only option. We started out slow, always afraid of what we'd see at the next corner in the tunnel. When we reached the entrance to the mine, we almost lost our composure. We climbed the slopes and ladders and eventually reached the surface. Neither of us have talked about what we saw down there, but we both know that we can't go back. The third story this week is a true one. All details can be found online. Story number 3, the Dilatov Pass Incident. On February 26, 1959, Mikhail Sharavin, a young Russian student, stood over a shredded tent. After nearly 6 days of searching through the snow, he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. He called over the other members of the search party, who examined the area closely. Mikhail would later write, quote, "The tent was half torn down and covered with snow. All the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. The marks in the snow surrounding the tent were easy to read. All of the people who'd left the tent behind were either wearing socks, single shoes, or barefoot. The investigators examined the remains of the tent more closely and saw clear signs that it had been cut open from the inside. In 1959, a group of 10 Russian skiers set off on a cross-country expedition. They were led by Igor Dilatov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student. Most of them were Dilatov's fellow students at the Ural Polytechnical Institute in the Ural region of Russia. The purpose of their trip was to receive a Grade 3 hiking certification. In the Soviet Union, This certification was awarded only after a 300-kilometer or 190-mile journey was completed. The group's last contact with the outside world happened at the small town of Evedale, where the group reportedly purchased bread and spent the night before starting their expedition. The following morning, the 10 hikers began their journey. One of their members, a 21-year-old man named Yuri Yudin, suffered from chronic health problems. He decided to turn back due to his knee and joint pain, making his way back down to Evedale. He would be the only survivor of the expedition. We can track the party's next few days through their journals and other clues they left behind. One such clue is a cache of food and equipment they left in a valley, apparently expecting to use it as they made their way back down. A day after leaving the food and equipment, they began moving through a pass. It's theorized that they were attempting to cross the entire pass in just one day. For an unknown reason, possibly poor weather conditions, they were blown off course, instead hiking up the western slope of the pass. Somehow, they discovered their error. A mile downhill was a wooded area that would have given far better protection from the wind and the elements. But instead of continuing on or heading to the woods, the group decided to make camp for the night on the slope. Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor, made this guess, quote, "Dailatov probably did not want to lose the altitude they had gained, or he decided to practice camping on the mountain slope." From here, what exactly happened is up to guesswork and interpretation. What isn't up to interpretation, however, are a series of facts. Fact number 1. The hiker's tent had been torn open from the inside, apparently by the hikers. Fact 2. The hikers had run into the night without any form of illumination, coats, or footwear. Fact 3. At the edge of the woods, nearly a mile away, bodies of 2 of the 9 hikers were found beside the remnants of a fire. They were without shoes and dressed in nothing but their underwear. Fact 4. Branches of the tree beside the 2 bodies were seen to be broken up to 15 feet up, suggesting that someone had climbed the tree. Fact 5. 3 additional bodies were found spread out between the tree and the tent, including Dailatov. The poses of their bodies suggested that they were attempting to return to their tent. Their bodies were separated by hundreds of meters. The final 4 hikers' bodies were found not towards the tent, but deeper into the woods. Evidence suggests that these hikers survived for longer. It appears that these 4 scavenged the meager clothes from the bodies of the hikers who had died earlier. Fact 7. 3 of these 4 final hikers died not of hypothermia, but of blunt force trauma. 2 of them had major chest fractures, as if from an impact, and 1 had a skull fracture. The force required to sustain these injuries was compared by an investigator to a car crash. Fact 8. There were no survivors. Over the decades since the incident, there have been dozens of theories put forward regarding the cause of these deaths. Before I get into them, I want to lay down what I feel are the 2 central problems that any theory must try to explain. The first problem is that this group of experienced climbers cut their way out of their tent in sub-zero temperatures, running out into the night without shoes or proper clothes. What this says to me is that they were trying to get away from something as fast as possible. The second is that whatever caused the deaths of these last 3 hikers must have been something capable of causing extreme force. Remember, they had broken ribs and skulls. An unlikely explanation for their injuries is that the 3 hikers were found at the bottom of a small ravine. It's been postulated that perhaps a fall into this ravine caused the injuries, but I find that a bit hard to believe. A short fall caused 3 people to suffer severe chest injuries, but not arm or leg injuries? With that being said, here are a few proposed explanations. Number 1. Avalanche fear. This theory states that all the campers woke up in the middle of the night to hear an avalanche approaching. They were in a hurry and so cut through their tent to escape the snow, leaving their clothes behind to avoid being swept away. When the group made it to the relative safety of the woods, they realized that no avalanche was coming. Some started a fire, while others attempted to return to the tent for supplies. The broken ribs in the skull occurred when the remaining 4 went deeper into the woods and were caught up by another avalanche, breaking their bones while searching for a better shelter, falling into the ravine. This theory explains why the campers would have left their tents in a hurry, and does a fair job of explaining their injuries and positions. There's just one problem. When the explorers arrived at the area, there were none of the telltale signs of an avalanche, not around the tent and not near the bodies. Also, in the half-century since the incident, not one avalanche has been recorded in the Dilatov Pass. So, the best and most simple explanation falls apart. Number 2. Military tests. Another explanation alleges that the Russian government was experimenting with parachute mines. Parachute mines are massive bombs dropped from airplanes that explode in midair. According to sources, the Soviet military was experimenting with these bombs in an area that included the Dilatov Pass. This explanation would fit with the campers waking in a state of shock and disorientation, cutting their way out of the tent and running from the bombing area. Perhaps upon reaching the trees, the bombs stopped. Dilatov and the others attempted to return to the tent for supplies and were unable to reach before succumbing to the cold. This also explains the injuries of the final 4 hikers. If they wandered into the blast zone, they'd certainly be hurt. A problem I see with this theory is that if a bomb was powerful enough to break ribs, it almost certainly would have left markings on the trees in the area. Perhaps the search team members were not trained to look for these markings, but it's hard to believe that none would have been left at all. Number 3. Creature attack. The final theory put forward is that the hikers were attacked by a creature in the night. Perhaps they heard it through the tent by the entrance and cut through the back to escape, fleeing into the woods. Once they reached the woods, the hikers realized that they'd stand no chance without supplies. So they attempted to return to the tent, but froze before they could make it back. Perhaps this same creature met up with the final 4 hikers and attacked them, causing their injuries. Whatever happened in Dilatov Pass, it's likely we'll be learning more about it. According to CNN, the Russian government is reopening an investigation into the incident. Perhaps the new investigators will come across some piece of evidence that the other investigations missed. I hope you all enjoyed these stories. Support me on Patreon, check out my novella, and be sure to leave a rating if you did. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed your time on Worchester Street.